So decided to double dip today with the videos since I didn't do one on Wednesday. And this video will be on more foreign international policy and how we treat our friends different from our enemies, and why on the surface that may be okay, but it has its limits to how okay it is, and how it can also hurt us as well. So we can look at a few examples of this. Particularly, this was focused on the Middle East and Latin America, because that's what I've seen in the news the most. But when we look at behavior and response to certain activities, when our friends do it, we have one type of response, and when our enemies do it, we have another response. And I understand the idea behind that traditionally this is what you do, this is how it works, and frankly no one's going to be able to tell because who's keeping track. But nowadays it's not so simple with technology, with social media, with videos. If we are not being consistent, it's very easy to call us out on it. So just looking at a few examples, when we look at two allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, versus an enemy, Iran. Now, all three of these countries, if you do any research on, you can see they have very significant human rights issues. And however, two of the three actually do have some democratic elements in their country. So it's hard to see too sometimes. But when you look at Israel, in terms of within Israel proper, is a Western style parliamentary democracy. So that's fine in terms of government system. And it's a good thing in that regard, because I saw this point made and I liked it. There is a chance for improvement. You can get better people in if, the old throw the bums out idea. But at the same time, the government still must be held accountable for their actions. I'll get back to that in a second. Just as in Iran, you have a kind of split, part theocracy, part democracy on its surface, where you do have elections, and usually they are fair, not all the time as we saw in 2009, but you see right now they have a relatively moderate guy by their standards, but they also have an unelected aspect, a theocratic aspect, with names like Supreme Leader, which is some shit you'd expect to hear in Star Wars, not in a real life country, but it's run by the clerical establishment, and you can't break that. It's very hard to break, and that's a very bad thing, and they have also human rights problems. Then what I would postulate is the worst of the three is Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy, so there's no democratic avenues for reform, and the reform you get is highly incremental. So obviously Saudi and Israel are allies, traditional allies, and Iran is a traditional enemy since 1979 revolution. In recent days, we've seen in Israel what's happened is they've had protests from Palestinians who are under occupation by Israel. And how's Israel responded? By shooting at least 750 protesters and about 15 killed, and saying, traditionally what they would always say is Hamas, who's a terrorist group, Palestinian terrorist group, who has committed terrible acts, but now has a power sharing agreement because for a long time they were running Gaza. They won the elections there. Maybe at one point I'll do a whole video or 10 on the Palestinian-Israeli situation, because there's a lot to cover there. I'd encourage you to look at it and look at all sources. But essentially, in this case, they've shot these protesters. They've said Hamas is using human shields. Now, traditionally, the media would take that, and just not question it. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's very likely that it does happen, and there are cases. But to the point of 750 people, protesters, most if not all of them unarmed, seems very unlikely. And there are now videos that have come out that shows people praying by the border, people clearly not armed, not doing anything, being sniped by snipers, Israeli snipers. So clearly human rights abuses. Many people have called it as such. For the U.S., I mean, other than Bernie Sanders, very few people have said anything. It's been almost complete silence, which is very curious, particularly interesting, because just a few short months ago, Iran had a number of protests, widespread protests, particularly labor-related. And as soon as the protests started, you had Marco Rubio and Donald Trump and all these people jumping and saying, we want to support the Iranian people. We want to support the Iranian people. And again, what the words they were saying were not particularly bad, because I agree. I mean, these people are protesting their government. They should not be shot. They should not be shut down. They should be able to have a voice. But these people like the neocons and Trump are very disingenuous about it. They act like they want us to do this. This really has nothing to do with that. It's all just a power play to try and weaken Iran because they are the opponent to their allies. So we should be consistent. We should say that, Iranians should have the right to protest freely, and we should call out when the Iranian government commits human rights acts. We should do the same also with Israel. All right, and that's important because that builds credibility when you do that. Okay, just a fact. And the final aspect of this is, again, like I said, Israel and Iran, they're democracies. They have democratic elements, especially Israel, which has a clear parliamentary democracy. The problem with Israel isn't so much that, as much as how it treats some of its citizens and some of its people who it doesn't even consider citizens. It's basically an apartheid system. That's more the issue there. When you're talking about Iran, you have the democratic elements, but you also have theocracy, which is not good. And they, of course, have very severe human rights issues as well, and treatments of anyone who speaks up. So it's a problem. But significantly worse than even these two is Saudi Arabia, which is a hermit kingdom. Kyle Kulinski from Secular has a very good way of calling Saudi Arabia ISIS who made it. This is true. These are the guys who peddled Wahhabism, the ideology behind ISIS, the ideology behind Al-Qaeda, all these groups. This is a Saudi creation, and their government has no democracy. Until only recently, women couldn't even drive. People are beheaded. We always get upset about ISIS beheading, and rightfully so. These guys do all beheadings too. Someone blogs anything they don't like, they come after them. If I was in Saudi Arabia, I couldn't do this kind of stuff without getting in trouble. So this is like the mentality. This is what we're talking about Saudi Arabia. And they have a new basically leader. He's not officially leader. He's not king yet, but he's the crown prince. And he's been doing a power play, Mohammed bin Salman. And everywhere, I think I've ranted about this, so I'm not getting too much into it. But you see the reaction. He's like going after political opponents, killing them, imprisoning them, and only because he did these very minute reforms. Suddenly women can drive. And now all of a sudden, the New York Times with Tom Friedman, 60 Minutes, all these groups are suddenly saying, oh, he's the reformer king. He's the reformer king. I mean, meanwhile, he's still, leading a battle in Yemen, which is not really a battle as much as genocide, and not a word about it, and that'll lead into something I'm going to say in a second. But just the idea of, we want to talk great things about Mohammed bin Salman, but we're going to be highly critical of Iran. We should be critical of both of them, honestly, and we should be especially critical of Saudi, because that's has no democracy at all, and the treatment. But because of oil and politics, sorry, I almost dropped my phone. Because of oil, and we want their oil and it's politics, we don't only ally with them, we sell them all these weapons that they use then on poor Yemeni kids and people at weddings and whatnot. So the whole thing is out of whack. And in the old days, you could get away with that. Now people see it, and they'll call it BS on you for it. So that leads in with Yemen to another aspect. We talk about Syria versus Yemen. Now, in my opinion, both of these conflicts are grossly underreported, unless we're talking in the sense of Russia. I think mainstream media, every day you got to talk about Russia, you talk about Stormy Daniels. We're not talking about any real issues, whether it's issues at home or like, Flint water crisis or other issues like that, real issues, problems with health insurance. And we don't talk about the issues abroad, like Syria and Yemen. Now, but at least there's some talk about Syria. And the reason is because you can do that in a way to criticize Bashar al-Assad, who's a really nasty dictator. When you talk about someone like the Russians and the Iranians backing him, when you had ISIS in play there, it's covered in that way. And it's covered also in a way that it's to criticize Russia, it's to criticize Iran, it's to criticize Assad. And I'm not saying they don't deserve criticism, they do, but I mean, what we've been doing there is also not the greatest. And we go in there. Why do we go in there? To fight ISIS. But they're also clashing with the government at times too. What Turkey's doing in there, no one's talking about that. I mean, Syria's got bad actors in it all over the place, and then the U.S. were saying we're arming quote unquote moderate rebels, and turns out some of those moderate rebels may in fact be Al-Qaeda. So we don't know what the hell's going on. So we should be talking about that. We should get some people there to learn about it. That's a big thing. And the root causes of that, what's happening now. I mean, how many people have died there? No one wants to talk about it. But I guess I shouldn't expect much less, because we can't even talk about like the problems we have in the cities here, let alone there. So it's already Russia and Stormy Daniels, which I'm not saying they shouldn't talk about, but there should be a balance in what people want to talk about. So by contrast, you hear nothing at all in Yemen. At least in Syria, you'll have criticism from elected officials. They'll say Bashar al-Assad has to go, things like this, because he's not aligned with us. On the flip side, when you go to Yemen, Senate can't even pass a sensible law to say we got to stop arming the Saudis and we got to remove our support for them just bombing the shit out of Yemen. Okay, and we want to say, it's all the Houthis who we say are controlled by Iran. It should be. I don't doubt that the Houthis are doing bad things there. I don't doubt that Iran has some bad motives there. But let's not sit here but it looks disingenuous to the rest of the world if we're going to, when videos of Saudi planes bombing weddings come out, that we're going to act so one-sided, okay? And then when you move to Latin America, you see what happened to Honduras recently, had basically a fraudulent election that supported a candidate that we liked. So we supported it and didn't do much. Brazil, what's been going on? Just recently, a left-wing socialist politician was murdered there. Their government was basically, there was a bloodless coup there in terms of the impeachment of the former president with another president that's more corporate friendly. And, there's been a lot of curtailing rights in those two countries. When then you go to the flip side, you don't hear about that. But Venezuela and Cuba, you have to hear a lot about. And again, Venezuela and Cuba, we should be talking about, because there were protests in Venezuela. So these things are legitimate. The Castros were not good. I mean, of course, we should be talking about it. But when you talk about it, you can't let people from, you can't have diplomatic relations with one, but you can with the other. So the point I'm getting at, I don't want to get too much more in the weeds, is there are bad actors all around, but we are not consistent. And in the old days, that might have been able to work. But now, you can't do that. You can't put that by people, because we see it in the social media. We see it in the videos. It's there. Even if the news doesn't report it, we see it. And it's not just us that sees it. It's the rest of the world that sees it. And when the rest of the world sees it, the U.S. loses credibility. The Western world loses credibility. And that's not good. Then they're going to be pushed more towards bad forces. They'll be more inclined to support, people that don't support democracy, that might be more radical, that might be more terroristic elements. We have to be a force for good in the world. And I'm not saying we were ever perfect, but And maybe, again, because of the technology, it was there and we didn't see it, but now we see it. So we need to do better in the world. We need to be more fair-minded in the world. We need to also look towards finding ways to help, developing nations and seeing what we can do to help them instead of just only helping multinational corporations. One last thing I want to touch on, because it really kind of bothers me, is Trump basically taking Duterte of the Philippines as his basically role model. The war on drugs has been a gross failure. It doesn't work. These kind of punishments, very vicious punishments of drug crimes doesn't work. We've seen. If it would have worked, we would have been done by now. Clinton tried it in the 90s. It didn't work. But in that regard, thinking about Duterte, this guy was looked as kind of Trump before Trump, but his platform in the Philippines, how he got elected, was basically saying he wants to kill all drug dealers, drug users, anything with drugs, he wants to kill them, and he wants vigilante justice on them. And this is how he talked in to Obama's credit. And Obama was far from perfect on foreign policy. He had his flaws. I mean, this is a very entrenched foreign policy establishment that I'm really speaking against right now. It's not just a Trump thing. But to his credit, he did in Syria, he resisted calls to get more involved. Again, not perfect, but it was, he took a lot of criticism from Republicans and Democrats on that. Because, frankly, all the stuff up to now I've been talking about, you're not hearing Democrats even talk much about it. You don't hear Chuck Schumer talking about it. You don't hear Nancy Pelosi talking about it. Because, in general, Democrats and Republicans on foreign policy are largely in line. The difference, luckily, is Democrats are not to the level of a John Bolton. So Democrats are better, but marginally. Not saying that you shouldn't vote for Democrats. I'm just saying this is a reality of the situation. But Philippines is kind of a Trump phenomenon. And he's already taken ideas from this guy who's crazy. He's over the top. I mean, how many thousands of people, I don't want to say a number because I haven't looked up, but myriads of people have been murdered for just being accused of even using drugs. It's a shit show. It's a disaster. And Trump's like, welcome you in. I like how you handle your drug policies and now he wants to do death penalty for drug dealers. Well, what's the next step? And we know that these policies don't work. With drugs, you got to work on rehabilitation, not incarceration. But a guy like Trump is all about mass incarceration. He loves that sort of thing because probably his buddies in the prison industry, for all I know. So this is just the unfortunate reality situation that you have to fight against. And all this really, again, comes back to these last two videos. We have to be able to speak honestly and candidly about our flaws. We're not perfect. It's okay. We have a lot of really big problems, though, which are not okay. We should just fix them. And it takes time, and I don't have all the right answers, but we need to talk about them. You talk about them, get some new ideas, figure out some ways to do it, and then we can get there. I mean, it really shouldn't be that hard. For example, Yemen's an easy one. Shouldn't be that hard. And even Democrats defected. I mean, you had a bipartisan solution that involved Republicans and Democrats to say, hey, tell the Saudis, we can't sell you arms, we can't support your war. Simple thing, and it lost. And it lost with Republican mostly, but also some Democratic votes. All right? I mean, we got to be smart in that. The times change. We can't think like the fucking Cold War is still going on, that we got to align ourselves in these big groups. Okay? I mean, and part of this blame also goes to the media. Part of the blame goes to the media too, because they're not covering it, because they're part of the problem. Because they're too busy talking about Russia every day. And Russia's also not a good actor for sure. And Putin is a thug. He's an oligarch. But you're talking about it in the sense of Trump. Every day I see CNN, they have to put this, or they put Stormy Daniels and this. And these are real issues that should be discussed. But these are also real issues. These are real issues too, and nobody wants to talk about it. And that's why they don't get fixed. Again, just like international policy, or you're talking about domestic policy and issues of income inequality, issues of police brutality, issues of high crime, issues of all these things. No one wants to talk about them. All right, there are people doing really good work, but they won't be talked about. So I think the more I'm looking into all this stuff, and I had a base knowledge anyways, but even I find the more I go into this and look at this, it's very depressing, honestly. And in that sense, it makes me kind of very distraught because there's just not, we're not changing. We're not doing a lot of things better. But there is some hope, to be sure. There are people doing very good work in all these areas, international and domestic policy. There are journalists who are starting to see it, and part of that is the rise of the internet, part rise of social media, and being able to see these things all over the world. I think back to 2009 when the Green Revolution happened in Iran, and social media is the first time I saw it. People, you could see through the bullshit, you could see through the lies, you know? And now here, we can see through it, so we have to do that. And we can't fight with each other based on race and skin color and these things. We gotta work together for the common good. So that's all I got for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Happy Easter to everyone celebrating. Happy Passover. And have a safe rest of the weekend. And I'll see you next time.